been trying to think of over the two panels is a practical application of speculative writing in our world. And to consider how it's used and interpreted in various aspects of our lives. So that's what we were doing. So yesterday was really interesting in terms of having John Titi Namai, a storyteller, and also Dr. Nonza, who's also, she has got a PhD as a storyteller. And her paper was on exploring the world through African speculative narrative. And John, again, as I said, spoke about Sigana Storytelling Festival and the way they use the stories in a practical application. But what was interesting from yesterday is we ended on the question that we should think about in this Q&A as well. We ended on the question with Bangile, who is a wonderful poet in South Africa, and she challenged the speakers by saying, well, okay, if we are saying that in African literature, literature has got a speculative aspect to it anyway, why are we calling it speculative? Why are we not just calling it fiction? So that's something I think maybe we should think about when it comes to the Q&A. Because she's right, we're often saying we've always been writing speculative anyway, yet we're now putting that tag to it to say that it's speculative. What does that actually mean? So that is something for us to think about. So what I was going to do, I'm going to start with my presentation, which is much shorter because I'm going to use it as an introduction to other things that we are doing. And for want of time, that makes it actually better. So my my presentation is called From Colonial African Tropes to Futuristic African Concepts, and particularly looking at the changing emphasis on the winning stories in the Cape Prize for African writing, and looking specifically around the shortlisted and the winning short stories in 2023, which is one of the ones I was judging. I was on the judging panel for that. And the interesting thing about that one is that was after there's 23, 24 years of the prize. Then it had the first, it was the first, the many firsts. It was the first all-women panel. It was the first shortlist that included, I think it was the first one that included a couple, anyway, included a co-written story, and it had to be a husband and wife team. And also in terms of having the first winner, which was from Francophone Africa as well. And the interesting thing about this one, which is also a first, is out of the 5 shortlisted winners, also out of 5 shortlisted stories, 3 of them were speculative writing. And we didn't pick them like that intentionally. It just happened because out of the almost 300 submissions, 280 submissions, something like that, I would say at least a quarter of them were speculative writing, which was really interesting. So there's going to be at least, getting into the shortlist, there was going to be some of them really getting into the shortlist. And the ones that did were very, very different. As the chair said, it really showed the breadth of African writing, even though, the genre was quite dominant that they came out of. It was quite strong in terms of the breadth of African writing in the show. So the 3 shortlisted stories that I'm going to talk about, a little bit about, was Daughters by Our Hands by Ekamini Pius, a Nigerian writer, Peeling Time by Peepal Tree from Botswana, and A Song of Small Places by Mame Dieng and Mboka from Senegal. So the first story, Daughters by Our Hands, that story, it was written by a young man. First of all, even though the names are there, we don't always look at the names, we're just kind of trying to get through the story. And so the stories were all quite women dominated, and that's not because it was a women's panel, they just really happened like that. And he said what sparked his idea for that story was to think about what would childbearing in a woman-only world look like. So even though in the story it wasn't necessarily a woman-only world, it was kind of like a woman-dominated world. It was like, how do women control how do they have control of childbearing? And what he did was, why it's called Daughters by Our Hands, is he was looking at the decision was in the length of the nails, of women's nails. With black women, we talk so much about hair. This time it wasn't about the hair, it was about the nails. So if women, by they got to a certain age and they had these beautifully elongated nails, that was where the wealth and the power was. And the women, young women who had those long nails, they could sell the nails for a lot of money. Because then whoever they were selling them to, it was a fertility thing. You've got the length of nails denoted the fertility. And that was where a lot of the money was. And it centers around, the story centers around the protagonist, Anima. And she decided she wasn't going to sell her nails for money. She didn't want children herself, which frustrated her mother, because it's like, you've got 10 of your beautiful nails, you either have the children or you sell your nails, let's get some money. And that was of no interest to her. It was who's going to look after the children the best way she felt possible. And so she gave some of her nails away. I think it was to like a bus driver or something like that, who the woman really wanted to have children. It drove her mother a bit nuts. But what was interesting in this was that, number one, in terms of the way that he thought about the fertility of the woman and the cyclical nature of the way her nails grew, but also in terms of that she could make that decision and she could make the choice of who she gave the nails to and the power that they carried. And that was really the concept of that, which was really interesting to us, the judges, in the way that that decision was made, and that these women could make that decision. And it's almost like, and you know, the story was taking place in a salon as well, a hair and a nail salon. So that concept is really interesting in terms of the women's fertility. The other one, Peel in Time, was written, is much more contemporary in a sense, in terms of the way that Doctor writes and her protagonist is Sowella. So at the beginning of the story, it was all about oppression. By the end of it, it's about freedom. First of all, it's oppression from a man, but then it's, at the end of it, it is the freedom that she gains and the way that she does it. And it's the whole structure. And again, it was more about, not so much about the story, but the way the story was written and the structure and of the story and the style of it was so oppressive. It's almost like you couldn't breathe when you were reading it because it just kept, it was really fast paced. And you just felt that release of the freedom at the end. And again, it's all about the power that the women can control for themselves in the story. And the third one, and which was the winning story as well, was A Song of Small Places, which all came out of myth and legend, that it was set in West Africa and these girls were attacked and a child was raped by like travelling, I don't know necessarily their farmers, but by men who were kind of like, were like nomadic, even though the girls had home, they were nomadic. And near coming to the end of the story, what was happening was the girls were fighting back. They were fighting back, and we were talking about this last night when we went out, about the different forms that women can take, whether they be vampires or we'll call them girls that like vampires, and in the Caribbean they call them, Annie? Lajabless.
Yeah, Lajabless.
And things like that. So they were basically, women were taking on other forms that were deemed evil, and they were taking on those forms to fight back against the men. So again, they were changing themselves in terms of the power and that they could control to use for men. So we were kind of just like looking at all of those stories in terms of how this translates into a practical application in terms of especially gender-based violence, which is again what Dr. Nomza was talking about yesterday, and how prevalent it is in South Africa. In some ways, all of these three stories, they were all about how women take control and how women have the power, whether it's through money or otherwise. And when we were thinking about it, all of those applications. Hello. Hi, we have lots of people online now, sorry. And what was very interesting about it, and Dr. Nomza is online as well, what was really interesting about it was the fact that we could actually see this almost happening in reality, forms of it. So what was interesting, for example, about Song of Small Places it wasn't making the story almost and then kind of blowing that story up into say, this is fictionalized. It's almost like taking the myth and the legend and making that real.